the foolish bridesmaids did take their lamps, but they took no oil. Translate, we have our structure in perfect place, and we have our rhythm, but the oil of charity is missing. It can happen. Proof. One can have a solemn liturgy, but when something goes wrong, nothing is taught about upsetting gravely a brother or sister. Also, in a community, one can have even austerity and great observance of the rule, but little is taught about upsetting gravely a brother or sister. The Lord goes on to indicate that we need to be always ready, for we do not know the day or the hour. In the eve of life, it is on charity that we will be examined, as we are told by St. John of the Cross. Charity is the great interpreter of the law. With regard to being prepared, it applies to us, hic et nunc, right now. How many of us are at risk every time we get behind the wheel of a car or allow someone else to have the wheel? When a student in, first of all, the Jesuit place in in Dublin, and then the Collegiate of the Maryknoll missionaries in Rome, I was able to listen all the time to stories, because although studying in these centres of learning, I was living both in Dublin and in Rome with missionaries. That's how Providence made it happen. And it was a fascinating experience. One difference between there and elsewhere was this. When talking, for instance at table, one did not limit the conversation to the football game or the weather, but one went into just listening to the stories and experiences that such and such might have had out there on the missions. And it was far more serious than the football or the weather. And so it was that I remember hearing this kind of story. The rector of the house, who had been a missionary all his life in Africa and has since gone back to Africa to live, minister and die there, came out with this at table one day, casually. A friend of his, a priest in America, had to do a funeral, and it was this. A group of young men, all Catholics, 4 or 5 of them, that wanted to have some fun. And so they got hold of a car, not their own, and wanted a joyride. And so it was that they went off with themselves. They put the foot on the accelerator, and on they went, making the adrenaline flow. They got onto this new highway, just completed, or so they thought, and this gentleman on the sidewalk tried to warn them as they went on it to be careful, He just made gestures because he knew what was further down the high road. They poked fun at him and put the foot on the accelerator even harder. A few minutes later, they were parked in eternity. And this priest friend of our rector had to do the funeral. Catholic young men, a more or less stolen car, but certainly not a well-prepared encounter with eternity. Another time, a friend of mine, his name was Tony, Father Tony, this was actually in Dublin, casually at table, came out with this. When he was in the village, I think it was in Nigeria, Kenya possibly, I forget now, I think it was Nigeria, he was asleep and the phone rang. It was the police. He was being requested. His presence was needed in the centre of the village. There was to be a firing squad. About 10 young men were being lined up to be shot, involved apparently with drug trafficking. He immediately got up and prepared them for death. But he calmly said, in this our conversation, that he picked up very quickly that they never did it, they were all innocent, and that therefore they were being used as scapegoats. But then he went on to describe how he just had to turn away when there was this massive volley of bullets, so much so that the posts behind them were covered in blood and I think actually torn apart. They were dead in a few seconds. And it did occur to me how death and life are only separated by a second and by something very thin. When doing theology in France, the monk teaching us indicated that in a situation of execution, one was not actually allowed to anoint with the sacrament of the sick the person about to be executed, because physically he wasn't ill. He was almost ironic in the way he put it. One was right underneath the rope and it wasn't the slightest danger of death. But then the practice was apparently to jump straight in through the hatch and anoint the person 1 second after death, in case the soul was still there. Life and death at execution and also on the high road are 1 second apart. And on that second hangs and hovers all the weight of ongoing eternity. After hearing dear Father's story, I went into my cell and wrote this on the firing squad, at which Father Tony, a fellow student, gave absolution to the innocent. There are but bullets between a living soul and what it heard and shuffled. There are but bullets between a living soul and what it heard and shifted what it sensed as its accustomed home. And but a hole or two or three let fly a cry condensed with all the pain of parting. For the scream that settles in the sky asunder racks the riddles of a being that did seem all one, ere came these little chinks and cracks. A bullet walks but once, and onward goes the naked roving of the spectred mind, with weight of memory laden. Mid the throes of many hurting moments left behind. And there are many hovering around, still hearing, but a distant, sharp